Just like to offer a big shout out to Touchdown Digital, the sponsor of this week's video.
Well, hello everyone, Glenn Samuel here. Today I want to talk to you about 3 settings which I believe will transform your landscape photography from here to here. Now, a lot of you are probably using these settings, or you have a good understanding of these settings. But these 3 settings are what I believe to be critical to landscape photography, your landscape photography. And if you're not really familiar with these 3 settings, or you're not quite sure, I think that if you employ these 3 settings to your landscape photography will elevate to another level. Now, what are these 3 settings? Well, basically the first one is Aperture Priority. Now, I know there's plenty of photographers out there that say manual is the way to go. Shoot manual all the time. Well, yes and no. The only time I use manual settings or have the camera switched completely manual in my landscape photography is when I'm photographing waterfalls, because I have to control the speed of the water, which comes down to shutter speed, and that's why I only use manual when I'm photographing waterfalls. But the rest of the time, or the majority of my landscape photography, I shoot in Aperture Priority, because with landscape photography, really the only thing that you're concerned about is your aperture. In other words, your depth of field. Now, with Aperture Priority, you just set your aperture, say f8 to f11, maybe f16, and let the camera pick out the shutter speed. Now, over the years in the workshops that I've conducted, I've seen people miss the opportunity to capture really nice images because they've been fiddling around, fussing around with the manual settings, and the light's changing every few minutes. They miss the shot. But if they were in Aperture Priority, all they would have had to have done is used exposure compensation. And when you use Aperture Priority and you've set your aperture, because that's the only real thing in landscape photography we're really worried about is the aperture for the depth of field. If the exposure isn't right, well then you just go into exposure compensation, either 1 or 2 stops less or 1 or 2 stops right. So with the combination of shooting in Aperture Priority and using the exposure compensation dial on the camera, you will basically nail the exposure. There is no doubt about that. So Aperture Priority for me is what I use, and my personal opinion is if you haven't tried Aperture Priority, go ahead and try it, because you will see a big difference in the quality of your photography, the quality of your images. So that's Aperture Priority all the way for me. Now, the next thing is shooting in RAW. Now, I don't know why people shoot in JPEG anymore. I know that JPEG's good for certain circumstances, but really with JPEG, you're letting the camera control everything, where in RAW, you're capturing as much information in that file. You've got to start to think of files with your photography, and you need as much information captured in that file as much as possible. So by shooting in RAW, you're able to go into an editing platform and drag out all that information that is on that file that you caught in the raw image, the raw file. Where with JPEG, you're very limited as to how much editing you can do with a JPEG file, because the camera's done it for you, and it's not really applicable to landscape photography from what I can gather. I always shoot in RAW, have been shooting in RAW for many, many years, and it's like I've often said in other videos that I've put up here on Sniper Photography about shooting in RAW. It's like driving a Porsche in first gear and you're not getting the full benefit out of that most magnificent vehicle. So shooting in RAW is a must, especially if you're going to really get into your landscape photography and want to improve your images within your landscape photography, then try shooting in RAW. The next thing is histograms. Now, I think over the past decade or so, the histogram in the camera has been a revelation. Don't worry about megapixels. The megapixel war's over. The histogram itself, if you can get your head and mind around the histogram and what it does for your photography, you're much better off. Now you've got to remember, the histogram has 290 points, 0 to the left, 290 to the right. So right of the histogram is white or bright, left of the histogram is dark or the shadows. Now you really want something in between. In layman's terms, you've got a square, and you don't want the histogram up against the left-hand side or the right-hand side, vice versa. You want it somewhere in the middle. Now you will get peaks and troughs, and you'll also get what they call the devil's horns, which is it'll come along flat like that, then it'll go up in two peaks. They're called the devil's horns on your histogram. Now the way to fix that or to alleviate that sort of problem is you're in Aperture Priority, you look at your exposure compensation and just move that histogram somewhere in between. You don't want it to hit the left-hand wall or the right-hand wall and vice versa. There is a thing that I do, it's called E2TR, that's exposed to the right, where I push the histogram as far right as possible without blowing out the highlights. That is the key. You don't want to blow out your highlights. So by pushing it to the right as much as you can then go into your editing process, because you're shooting in RAW, and bring back the highlights, but you're retaining the shadow. You're not increasing the shadow as much. In other words, you will get noise. Doesn't matter how good your camera is, you will get noise if you start to increase a very dark area of that image. So understanding a histogram, how it works, why you need it, and why does it employ so much importance to your landscape photography. And that's the histogram. You've got to make it your friend. Make the histogram your friend. It's something that you really need to understand, and it will save the day. If you can understand your histogram and how to work it with your exposure, your images will improve tenfold. I can give you a gold-plated guarantee on that. So there we have Aperture Priority, shooting in Aperture Priority. The only thing you're concerned about is your aperture. Shooting in RAW to obtain all that raw material and information in that RAW file and bring it out through your editing process, so shoot in RAW. And understanding and learning how to use the histogram with your landscape photography is paramount. Now, one other thing, and that's tripods. Now, I don't know how many times I've seen people go out and spend $5,000 and $6,000 on a camera and lens, and they use a very flimsy tripod to support a rather expensive piece of equipment. We're talking about balance here, and we're talking about strength, but we're talking about stability. And I own 6 tripods for my landscape photography, and none of them have center columns. I don't like center columns. However, my tripods go to 2.1 metres, so they're a very, very high tripod. I'm a tall man, so they do go past my height at 2.1 metres. So if you're in the market for a new tripod, buy a really strong, sturdy tripod. Spend a bit of extra money. I think people go out and blow their budget on the camera and lens and a few bits and pieces, and then they've got a couple of $100 left to buy a tripod. I'd rather you don't buy that tripod. I'd rather you save your money and buy something worth $500, $600, $700, $800. That way you'll get a good solid tripod, and a tripod of that value will outlast the camera. It'll probably outlast you. So just on a side note, use a very, very strong, sturdy, stable tripod. Whether it's aluminium or carbon fibre, it doesn't matter. It might be a little bit heavier, but that's what you want. Flimsy tripods, light tripods don't equate to good, strong, sharp images. So just another side note there. So let me know what you're shooting. Do you shoot in manual or Aperture Priority or shutter priority? What do you do? I'm very interested in this subject. It's very important that you understand the principles of the histogram and why you need to know how to use it and how it affects your image or images. And always shoot in RAW. That way your photography will improve. Editing is now part of our photography. So shooting in RAW will enable you to draw out as much information as possible. So that's it. That's another video for today. I really enjoy your comments on my videos. I try and put them out there on a weekly basis. I love teaching people this great pastime we call photography. One more side note. There's a particular gentleman that has a YouTube channel called Scotty Man Photos. It's Michael Scott from Scotty Man Photos. Do yourself a favour and subscribe to his channel. He's a big Texan from the United States. He's a superman. He's a great guy, and he comments on my videos. I comment on him, on his videos. We converse in that way. But it's Michael Scott from Scotty Man Photos. I suggest you take a look at his channel and feel free to subscribe to his channel, Michael Scott, Scotty Man Photos. So that's it for another episode of Sniper Photography. Thank you for joining me here today. My name's Glenn Samuel, and as always say, be nice to yourself, family and friends, but most of all, you keep shooting, keep smiling. Bye for now.